Night breathes like a living thing over the Elburz Mountains. Wind slips through dry juniper and rattles the iron rings on a gate high above the world. Far below, lanterns flow along a caravan road like scattered embers. Far above, a fortress clings to a knife-edge cliff, its walls black against a river of stars. The locals call it Alamut, the eagle's nest. On this winter night of 1090, the stones hold the last warmth of daylight and the first secrets of an age about to change. Inside a narrow chamber that smells of ink and oiled leather, a thin man writes by lamplight. His beard is neat, his eyes unwavering, his hand a metronome of purpose. Hassan-i Sabbah murmurs lines of Quranic verse under his breath, then marks a map with points of fire. Rai, Isfahan, Nishapur. Names of cities, names of pressure points. He does not pray for victory. He engineers it with geometry, patience, and faith sharpened like a blade. Outside, snow begins to fall in hushes. They will call his followers many things, Hashishin, heretics, phantoms. But they call themselves something quieter and far more exact. Fida, those who devote themselves. Not zealots, not brigands. Devotion as logistics. Their war is fought in courtyards and stairwells, at sunrise prayers and courtly banquets. Their weapon is proximity at precisely the second no one expects. A knife placed where a whisper should be. A warning left on a pillow softer than any shout from an army of 10,000. Across the mountains, the Seljuk Empire hums like a hive, its viziers and governors armored in power that feels eternal. Crusader ships groan toward the Levant, bearing men who will soon learn a new word and speak it with fear. But for now there is only the black geometry of the peaks, the quiver of torchlight, and a plan rock steady in a scholar's hands. By dawn, the quietest act in Persia will tilt the world by a fraction, and the rest will follow. The snow had barely stopped falling when the messenger arrived. His horse collapsed at the gates of Alamut, lungs steaming, hooves split from the desperate climb. From the saddle he carried a single word sealed in wax, but inside the fortress, Hassan-i Sabbah already knew its contents. He always knew. The letter was only proof of what his calculations had already revealed. Another Seljuk vizier had been moved into place, and another shadow of opportunity had fallen across Persia. Alamut was not a fortress built for comfort. Its walls clung to cliffs like talons. Its chambers were narrow, its air always sharp with the smell of smoke and iron. But for Hassan, it was perfection. Here, high above the valleys of Dalam, he had carved a state out of stone and faith, not with armies, but with geometry, patience, and a kind of devotion the world had not yet learned to fear. His men, the Fida were not soldiers in the usual sense. They were instruments. They did not need numbers. They needed only proximity, a blade, and the silence of certainty. It was said that Hassan promised his followers paradise, that he drugged them with hashish, led them into gardens of silk and song, and convinced them heaven awaited if they obeyed. That was the story their enemies told, the story from which the very word assassin would one day be born. But inside Alamut's walls, the truth was colder, sharper. Paradise was not a garden. Paradise was certainty. When Hassan spoke, his voice carried the weight of geometry, lines, angles, inevitabilities. The world could not be bent, only calculated. His men listened, and they believed. Beyond the mountains, the Seljuk sultans ruled vast lands with gold and armies, but they were never safe. Viziers schemed against generals, brothers plotted against brothers, and every throne was a seat carved from wax, melting as the candles of ambition burned around it. Into this chaos, Hassan inserted a single variable: fear. Not the fear of armies or sieges, but of the man kneeling behind you in the mosque, of the servant who bowed too low at your table, of the whisper in the market that tomorrow it might be your turn. On the night the messenger arrived, Hassan walked the battlements of Alamut, snow crunching under his sandals. Below, the valley stretched in black silence. His men trained even in the cold, blades glinting in torchlight, each motion repeated with monastic patience. Hassan stopped, looked down, and whispered a single phrase. "Tomorrow a vizier dies." And when he said it, the mountains seemed to lean closer, as if eager to listen. Dawn rose over Isfahan in shades of copper and ash. The city stirred awake with the smell of bread from clay ovens, the shuffle of donkeys across the bazaar, and the echo of muezzins calling men to prayer. To an outsider, it seemed peaceful, eternal. But inside the palace of Nizam al-Mulk, the great vizier of the Seljuks, the air was heavy with suspicion. He was a man who had ruled behind the throne for decades, older than the sultan he served, feared and respected as the architect of an empire. His enemies called him the Spider, for his webs reached across Persia, Anatolia, and beyond. But spiders are vulnerable when the blade finds the center of the web. On that morning in 1092, a stranger slipped into the prayer line behind the vizier. He looked like a wandering dervish, robes worn thin, eyes downcast. No guard questioned him. Who would? Men of God did not carry swords. But Hassan-i Sabbah had calculated everything. The vizier's route, the time of his prayers, the way the guards' attention drifted when they bent to their knees. The fida, I moved with the rhythm of devotion. He bent when the others bent, rose when the others rose, his lips murmuring the same verses. His hand trembled only once, when it brushed the dagger hidden in his sleeve. Then came the moment. The vizier bowed, his back exposed, the weight of years upon his shoulders. The fida, I stepped forward. Steel whispered. A single thrust, clean and deliberate, between ribs and into the heart. The vizier gasped once, then collapsed onto the prayer rug, his blood soaking into the woven patterns of paradise. Chaos erupted. Guards drew swords, worshippers scattered, but the assassin did not flee. He stood calmly as blades pierced him from every side, his lips still moving in prayer, his eyes locked on eternity. By midday, word had flown like fire across Persia. Nizam al-Mulk was dead. The vizier of the Seljuks, the spider of the empire, cut down not by an army, not by a rival prince, but by a single man who walked into his presence with nothing but a dagger and unshakable certainty. And everywhere, people whispered the same name, Hassan-i Sabbah. Some cursed him as a heretic. Others spoke of him with awe. But all felt the same cold truth. No fortress, no guard, no throne was safe from the men of the eagle's nest. In Alamut, Hassan received the news without triumph. He simply nodded, as if the death had already been written in the lines of his map. He told his disciples, "One dagger in the right place is worth an army in the wrong." The fida, I had not died in vain. He had written the first line of a legend that would haunt kings, caliphs, and crusaders alike for centuries. And the Seljuk Empire, vast and mighty, had just discovered that the smallest cut could bleed the deepest. The story spread like wildfire through Persia, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and frightened officials. It changed with every retelling, but its heart remained the same. Hassan-i Sabbah's men could strike anywhere at any time, and they welcomed death with a serenity that chilled the blood of their enemies. To explain such fearlessness, people whispered a darker tale, that Alamut held not just walls and weapons, but paradise itself. The legend began with captured servants and defectors, who swore they had seen it with their own eyes. They spoke of a hidden garden high in the fortress, lush with rivers of milk and wine, perfumed with roses, shaded by fruit trees, heavy with figs and pomegranates. There, Hassan was said to lead his followers after feeding them a draught of hashish, They would awaken in the garden, surrounded by maidens with eyes like stars, music like water flowing, honey sweeter than life itself. When they awoke again in the cold stone halls, Hassan told them, "You have tasted a fragment of paradise, now go and win the rest with your sacrifice." Historians argue whether the garden truly existed or whether it was the invention of enemies desperate to explain the unexplainable. But to the outside world, the story was enough. A soldier may fear wounds, but how do you fight a man who believes the next breath of steel will carry him to heaven's gate? Meanwhile, Hassan cultivated the myth with silence. He never denied it, he never explained. Instead, he let the world's imagination do his work. When his envoys visited rival lords, they carried no armies, only veiled warnings. Sometimes a dagger lay across the pillow of a sleeping prince, placed there by unseen hands. Sometimes a loyal guard was found one morning with his throat opened, no sign of struggle, only a message pinned to his tunic: "You are within our reach." In Damascus, a Sunni preacher who thundered against Hassan in his sermons was found slumped against the pulpit, stabbed to death before his flock. In Aleppo, a governor who mocked Alamut at a banquet choked on his wine when a dagger clattered onto the floor beside his cup. No killer was ever caught, no assassin ever fled. They struck, they killed, and they died where they stood, their eyes calm, their mouths whispering prayers. Even the mighty crusaders who came from Europe soon learned to dread the shadow of Alamut. Knights clad in steel trembled when, after a battle, they found slips of parchment pinned to their tents with curved daggers. "We can reach you." By the early 12th century, the word hashishiya, hashish eaters, was spat by their enemies, who believed only drugs could explain such devotion. From this insult, the West would one day forge a darker word: assassins. But for Hassan's followers, the name was irrelevant. They did not need labels. They needed only purpose. And in the mountains of Persia, that purpose grew sharper with every whisper, every rumor, every tale of the garden that no outsider could prove existed. Yet all feared might be real. The mountains of Persia could not contain Hassan's vision. By the early 12th century, Alamut was not merely a fortress, but the beating heart of a network stretching across Persia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. From its high halls, orders traveled in whispers, and in the cities below, men and women who appeared as scholars, merchants, or humble servants awaited only a signal. The Fida is where everywhere and nowhere. In Baghdad, an Abbasid official left his chamber one dawn to find a curved dagger nailed into his door with a note: "Next time, it will be in your chest." In Aleppo, a prince who dared plot against the Ismailis found his most trusted guard cut down beside him during prayer. In Damascus, two assassins disguised as Sufi mendicants slipped into a palace courtyard, their blades flashing in the moonlight before they themselves were cut down, smiling even as they fell. It was not the number of deaths that shook the world, it was the manner of them. Armies could be resisted, sieges could be withstood. But Hassan's Fida is struck at the places where a man felt most secure: his mosque, his table, his very bed. No fortress wall could guard against the hand already inside the chamber. The dread became more powerful than the killings themselves. Rulers awoke sweating, uncertain which of their own servants might already belong to the eagle's nest. The Crusaders, too, learned this lesson. In the fortress of Tortosa, a Frankish knight laughed over wine about the heretic Persians and their mountain eyries. Days later, as he bathed, an unseen hand pressed steel against his throat. His body was found floating in the moat by sunrise. In Antioch, the great Lord Raymond II rode out from his gates with banners streaming, only to be swarmed by men who seemed to appear from the crowd itself, daggers rising and falling until his lifeblood soaked into the dust. Even the kings of Jerusalem tread cautiously. Amalric I, legend says, received emissaries from Alamut who offered neither tribute nor alliance, but only a demonstration. In the great hall, before the eyes of his court, two young squires suddenly stepped forward, revealing daggers hidden in their robes. They did not strike. They only pressed the blades against their own hearts and smiled. The message was clearer than any treaty. Your life is a gift we can take back whenever we choose. Through it all, Hassan never left Alamut. He ruled not with armies in the field, but with silence, fear, and the unshakable devotion of his disciples. He read reports by lamplight, traced the lines of maps, and wrote his commands with the steady hand of a scribe who knew the world was clay, waiting to be carved. In time, the Seljuks tried to break him. They sent armies into the mountains, battering the walls of his strongholds. But the assassins did not need to win battles. They needed only to outlast, and to remind every commander who approached their cliffs that death might already be walking beside him. Time after time, the attackers withdrew, leaving Alamut still crouched on its eagle's perch, untouchable. By the time Hassan was old and his beard had turned white, the name of the assassins was whispered in every court between Cairo and Constantinople. Princes bowed to sultans, sultans bowed to caliphs, but all trembled when a dagger appeared on a pillow or a whisper reached their ear in the night. You are within our reach. And in the candlelit chambers of Alamut, Hassan closed his eyes and smiled. His war had never been for territory or gold. It was for fear itself, and in that war, he had already won. By the second decade of the 12th century, Hassan-i Sabbah was no longer a young revolutionary pacing the ramparts of Alamut. His hair had whitened, his body thinned by years of fasting and discipline. Yet his presence within the fortress had only grown more formidable. To his disciples, he was not merely a leader, but a figure carved from prophecy itself. To his enemies, he had become something darker, the old man of the mountain, a name whispered with the same unease as one might whisper plague or famine. It is said that in all the 35 years he ruled from Alamut, Hassan never once descended from its cliffs. He ate little, lived simply, and kept his chamber bare except for scrolls, weapons, and a prayer rug. Even when his closest companions begged him to enjoy the pleasures of power, he refused. Paradise is not here, he would answer. Paradise is in obedience. But obedience demanded sacrifice, and his reign proved merciless even to his own. When one of his sons was accused of drunkenness, Hassan had him executed before the entire garrison. The message was clear. There would be no immunity, not even for blood. Alamut's strength lay in absolute devotion, and to falter was to die. By then, his legend had already crossed oceans. European crusaders returning from the Levant told tales of a sect of fanatics who could appear anywhere, who believed themselves immortal, who were promised gardens of paradise if they obeyed their master's word. Chroniclers in France and England embroidered the stories with exotic terror. The assassins drank hashish before their killings, they claimed. Their old man lulled them into dreams of heaven and sent them back into the world with daggers kissed by angels. No matter how distorted, the kernel of truth struck deeper than any sword. A man who did not fear death could not be conquered. The sultans of Persia still tried. Armies marched against Alamut again and again. Siege engines battered its walls, and soldiers scaled its cliffs. Each time they were repelled, not by sheer strength, but by terror itself. Commanders would wake to find a dagger lying beside them in their own tent, or their most trusted officer suddenly turning against them mid-battle. The mountains themselves seemed haunted. Men deserted rather than march within reach of Hassan's shadows. Finally, in 1124, after decades of orchestrating daggers in the dark, Hassan's body failed him. He summoned his most trusted lieutenants, dictated his final instructions, and prepared his followers for the decades of struggle still to come. When he died, the fortress fell into silence. His disciples washed his body, wrapped it in white cloth, and buried him beneath Alamut stones. High above the valley, he had turned into a citadel of fear. But in truth, Hassan never died. His legend only grew larger in absence. To the Crusaders, he became the eternal old man of the mountain. To Muslim rulers, he was a ghost who could still send blades into their chambers from beyond the grave. Even centuries later, when the Mongols would finally reduce Alamut to ashes, the stories lingered, staining the word assassin with a permanence that history has never erased. In the end, Hassan-i Sabbah conquered nothing. He ruled no empire, commanded no vast armies, minted no coins. Yet kings, caliphs, and crusaders bent beneath the shadow of his name. His true dominion was fear itself, an empire wider than Persia, deeper than Rome, older than any throne. And that empire, born in a lonely mountain fortress, still echoes in the very language we speak today. The Crusader states of the Levant were carved from blood and ambition, fragile kingdoms caught between desert, sea, and the shadow of older empires. Their lords thought themselves conquerors, chosen by heaven to rule where prophets once walked. But even armored knights, hardened by battle and crusade, found their pride eroded by whispers of the assassins. In the hills of Syria, far from Alamut but loyal to its creed, the assassins established smaller strongholds, castles like Masyaf, Cadmus, and Al-Kaf. From these mountain eyries they extended Hassan's legacy long after his death. Travelers brought back stories to Europe that blurred fact and legend, of warriors who trained from childhood to obey without hesitation, of gardens where wine flowed like rivers, of a master who commanded life and death with a gesture. When King Amalric of Jerusalem sought to expand his borders, he found himself negotiating not just with Muslim princes, but with emissaries of Masyaf. The chroniclers describe how a Frankish lord, bold with wine, mocked the assassins as mere brigands. Days later, he was found in his chamber with a dagger buried in the wood beside his head, the blade gleaming in candlelight. No one had seen the intruder enter. No one knew when they had gone. Amalric himself began to treat the assassins not as pests, but as equals to be bargained with. Decades later, the name of the assassins reached even the ears of Richard the Lionheart. In the 1190s, as he campaigned in the Holy Land, he heard tales of their power, how no Crusader lord or Muslim emir was beyond their reach. Richard, fiery and fearless in battle, admitted privately that a knife in the night was a foe even his sword could not parry. He sought parley with their leader at Masyaf, preferring alliance to enmity. Chroniclers differ. Some say the assassins agreed to neutrality, others that they offered Richard gifts, even a token dagger as a warning cloaked in respect. But the fact remains, the Lionheart himself, scourge of Saladin, bent his pride before the shadow of the old man's heirs. And then there was Saladin. The great Sultan of Egypt and Syria, famed for his honor, nearly lost his life twice to assassin blades. In 1176, as he besieged their mountain strongholds, two Fida is slipped into his camp at night. When Saladin awoke, he found a dagger pinned into the ground beside his pillow, along with a note, "Next time, it will be in your heart." He withdrew his army days later. Even a conqueror who had driven the Crusaders from Jerusalem chose not to test the patience of the assassins again. By the 13th century, every king, emir, and Crusader lord had heard the same lesson. Armies may win fields, but the assassins owned the night. They ruled no kingdom, yet kings sought their favor. They minted no coin, yet gold flowed in their coffers as tribute. They commanded no vast cavalry, yet horses stamped nervously at the thought of a dagger glinting in the shadows, and so the legend deepened. From Alamut to Masyaf, from Persia to Palestine, the assassins wove themselves into the fabric of myth. The word itself would survive long after their castles crumbled, carried west by crusaders who returned home with tales of a sect that worshipped death as a gift. In French, Italian, English, the name became twisted, but the meaning endured. Assassin, the dagger in the dark, the terror unseen, the servant of the old man of the mountain. When Hassan-i Sabbah closed his eyes for the last time in 1124, the fortress of Alamut remained exactly as he had shaped it, not a kingdom of land and armies, but of whispers and daggers. For more than a century after his death, his successors, called Dais, the Callers, ruled from those eagle cliffs, sending orders across Persia and Syria. Some were scholars, some zealots, some opportunists, but all inherited the same truth Hassan had carved into the world. The smallest blade, placed at the right moment, could unseat an empire. But empires, like mountains, shift. In the 13th century, a storm unlike any the assassins had faced came rumbling from the east, the Mongols. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, swept through Persia with fire and iron. Castles that had withstood Seljuks and Crusaders fell one after another. In 1256, after months of siege, Alamut itself surrendered. Its libraries were burned, its walls toppled, its gardens, real or imagined, reduced to ash. The old man's nest was torn from the cliffside, and the assassins as a power vanished into history. Yet their defeat did not end their dominion. By then their legend had already seeped too deep into the veins of history. Crusaders returning to Europe spoke in awed tones of a sect that sent young men smiling into death, of a master who promised paradise in exchange for a dagger's thrust. Chroniclers turned rumor into gospel. Poets and storytellers embroidered the tales, and in the languages of Europe, a new word hardened into permanence: assassin. Today, the ruins of Alamut still cling to their cliffs in northern Iran, broken stone against endless sky. Travelers who climb its heights say the wind whistles through its shattered towers like a whisper too old to decipher. But the shadow of Hassan-i Sabbah endures. Not in territory, not in crowns or coins, but in the idea that fear itself can be a weapon more enduring than steel. Kings have fallen, dynasties erased, empires crumbled into dust. Yet when we speak of daggers in the dark, of plots that reach farther than armies, we still use the word born from those mountains: assassin. A single fortress is gone, but the echo of the old man of the mountain still lingers, as sharp as the first blade that cut through prayer in a mosque at dawn.